Arousal is a general physiological and psychological activation varying on a continuum from deep sleep to an intense excitement. Weinberg and Gold, 2007. Arousal is a blend of physiological and psychological activity in a person, and it refers to the level of motivation, alertness, and excitement at a particular moment. Weinberg and Gold, 2007. So Sarah and Nick would have a low arousal because they're playing badly and therefore they're not as aroused, and they haven't got as high a psychological and physiological activity, whereas Rachel will have a higher arousal as she is ready to play or perform, and it is linked to motivational drive. So Rachel would have more motivation and drive than Nick and Sarah, and the body is prepared for action. The function of the ANS, which is the SNS plus the PNS, and it is linked to the CNS, central nervous system, over time with us evolving, which gives us the flight or fight response. So Sarah and Nick respond with a flight response because they don't, when there's arousal or stress, they don't deal with it well and they fly away, whereas Rachel fights and responds well and overcomes the challenge. The RAS regulates levels of arousal and monitors the amount of stimulation that we have. What are Sarah and Nick's optimal levels of anxiety? So Rachel would have had medium arousal, which meant she was able to perform at her optimal best, because she has excitement and therefore she performs better, whereas Nick and Sarah both have over arousal, which leads to them being anxious and having fear, panic, or choking, which they both do when it comes to their matches, especially Sarah in those big games. Where none of the performers have low anxiety, which would lead to boredom and therefore mistakes are made. What are the influences of somatic and cognitive anxiety? Well, somatic plus cognitive anxiety equals arousal, which is a physiological and psychological readiness. So if you just have somatic, then you would have low arousal, but with them both together you get high arousal, as you can see in the top right image, and as you can see in the image below. When you have high arousal or overload, you have poor performance, as you have fear, panic, and choke. Medium, like Rachel, is arousal, you get high performance. High performance because you get excitement, whereas as you can see on the graph, low arousal leads to low performance and boredom. The drive theory. What is the drive theory? The drive theory is, as arousal goes up, so does performance. As you can see in the top right diagram, as arousal goes up, so does performance. But when arousal is low, so his performance is also low. Hull in 1951 had a very early and simplistic explanation, and he suggested there is a linear relationship and performance, so between arousal and performance. So obviously, as I just said, as arousal goes up, so does performance. Jonk in 1965 also developed his theory by using Hull's theory. He implied that other people being there or people around you increases arousal, which creates a dominant response, which is the most likely way that a performer will be able to do a skill or a task that they've been set. So, for example, Rachel has higher arousal, which means that she will perform better, whereas Nick and Sarah have lower arousal, so therefore their performance is lower. And Zajonk's theory is supported by Rachel, but isn't supported by Sarah, because having Rachel around means that her arousal is lower, meaning she has a less dominant response and performs worse. The equation for this is P equals F, which is HD. H is the dominant response and D is the arousal level or the drive. Increased arousal or drive will bring out the dominant response. Some of the positives of the drive theory are that it is correct for performers who have performed over a period of time or are experienced in that sport, and it is true for skills that are learned and the performer knows how to do them, where the dominant response is the right one, and it's also true for simple gross motor skills. However, the criticisms are that it doesn't really help or support inexperienced performers. It assumes that low arousal means poor performance when there's other factors that so for example, Nick and Sarah might just not, it's not that they have a low arousal, it could be other factors which we know that they don't like the big games and stuff. And for example, especially Sarah, who performs well in other games, so it shows it's not just her arousal. And novice performers will have a dominant response which isn't right, which means that it doesn't really support it, and there's also no differentiation between anxiety and arousal. Rachel is a good example for the drive theory, because as her arousal goes up, so does her performance, especially in the big games, because she's more aroused because she wants to do better against her local teams, which is the complete opposite to Sarah. The inverted U theory. As arousal goes up, so does performance up to an optimal level before it decreases. As you can see in the two diagrams, especially the top right diagram shows as arousal goes up, so does performance, except when you get to this part in the middle, once it gets to there, it starts to gradually decrease and decline. So therefore that shows that sometimes you can have too much arousal, sometimes a further increase in arousal leads to performance gradually declining. Arousal is the performance relationship, and this is called curvilinear. And in the bottom right diagram, you can also see that as arousal goes up, so does performance, up until this optimal arousal point before it gradually declines when arousal keeps going up. The type of task would be either a fine motor skill or a gross motor skill. The task complexity or decision making will also affect it, whether it's simple or complex. The performer skill level, whether they have a low skill or high skill, will also affect this, and their personality, whether they're an introvert or an extrovert. So, for example, Sarah and Rachel are more extroverted because they play a team sport like netball, whereas Nick is an introvert because he plays a normally individual sport like tennis. All the performers have a high skill level. They all have to make simple and complex decisions throughout, and they all have to do both types of motor skills. The positives of the inverted U theory are that the acceptance of worsened performance is if you are under or over aroused. The negatives are that sometimes optimal arousal doesn't occur at the midpoint of the curve. It could be before or after, and doesn't factor in that. And one curve couldn't explain the different optimal levels of arousal that needed to be used in simple and complex tasks, and the decline in performance isn't always gradual. For example, for Nick, after one mistake he falls away, which suggests there is rapid decrease in performance. What is the catastrophe theory? Fazey and Hardy in 1988 said performance doesn't always gradually deteriorate as arousal increases, like in the inverted U theory. If cognitive anxiety is low and somatic anxiety is high, then performance is like it is in inverted U and supports the inverted U theory. As you can see in the top right diagram, when there's low cognitive anxiety, as arousal increases, so does performance up to a certain optimal level, which supports the inverted U theory. Whereas in high cognitive anxiety, it also goes up to a certain point, but then it goes down gradually, then rapidly, then it is a steady plateau, which doesn't support the inverted U theory. When cognitive worrying and somatic anxiety is high, performance follows inverted U up to a point, but then the dramatic decline after that might happen after a certain point, as you can see in the bottom right diagram. This is a catastrophe within the performance. If a catastrophe does occur, there are small reductions in arousal. Small reductions in arousal won't bring performance back to its level before, and the performer must relax to get arousal back below the point before the catastrophe occurred. So, for example, the bottom right diagram could be showing Nick's performance, because this point here where it gradually decreases could be the point where he made that mistake where he fell off, where his game fell apart, so that he rapidly decreased in performance. Whereas the top right image could be showing Sarah's performance as it was going well until she got too over aroused in those big games and then missed lots of shots. Some of the positives for the catastrophe theories are that research supports this relationship between cognitive and somatic anxiety and performance, but the criticisms are it's hard to test this, because it's hard to test really cognitive anxiety because you can't see it, or you can't see it, it's all in your head, and you can't really predict performance that easily. Attention field and concentration. Nidefer 1976 argues that increased arousal levels might result in changes in attention and concentration. High arousal can sometimes happen if an athlete has too much information that they need to focus on at one time. So for example, Nick might be trying to think about everything his coach has said and trying to take in all the information that he's been given and how to play well, when really he needs to just focus on one thing. So for example, as you can see in the image on the right, low arousal leads to a too broad attention field, so you can't really focus on certain things. So especially for Nick and Sarah, this is true because they start missing shots. They can't focus on getting the shot in. And for example, on the right image, it shows that too much or high arousal makes your attention field too narrow, so you can't see external factors, and therefore they don't for example, in netball for Sarah, she wouldn't scan the field enough and wouldn't know where players are out wide if they were calling for the ball in space.